Gemara, today's blot is Daf Ayin Aleph Amid Aleph. And we were talking about in the Mishnah that an odel, somebody who's uncircumcised, a kohen who's uncircumcised, or he's tamei, he cannot eat truma. However, his wife and his avodim can because he's still a kohen. And we explained how do we know an odel cannot eat truma? We have sochir v'toishav that says by Korban Pesach, and sochir v'toishav says by truma, make it very shavah. Just like Korban Pesach, an odel is not allowed to eat from it. It says kol odel. The same thing over here. By truma, an odel cannot eat from it. And Rabbi Kiva said you don't need that. We have ish, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So Gemara said yesterday that you darshan from the word boy, because we were trying to also learn other dinim from Pesach, and we said no, you can't. And one of them it says boy, only in it. So Gemara said if you're going to be so pedantic, it also says the word mimenu by 8 lines on top of the page. It says 3 times mimenu. Mimenu means from it, as if also to exclude something. What's it coming to exclude? So Gemara says that comes to for Rabbah, what Rabbah we're going to learn in a few days from now, 3 times mimenu, what we learn from that. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Amar Ma. Let's go back to what we learned yesterday. Rabbi Kiva says, Ein tzaddik. You don't have to learn like Zeh Shavah Sachim Toshiv. So it says in the pasuk ish. It says in the pasuk that a person from Adam, if he happens to be tamei, you should not eat kachim, and over there kachim means truma until he goes to the mikveh. And the fact that it says till he goes to the mikveh tells us clearly we're not talking about kachim, because kachim is not enough to go to mikveh. Kachim you also have to bring karbanos the next day. So we're talking about truma. And as soon as it becomes, the mikveh and he waits for the sun to set, he can eat truma. And Ishi should tell you there's another person that can't, and that is an odel. Maybe it comes to include the oin. The same question we had yesterday, we're going to repeat again now. Because it had a special pasuk. Only a zar disqualifies you. In other words, a non-kohen cannot eat truma. Zar is a mark of loynes, but a kohen who's an oin can eat. So how do you know? Let us say that not only Yisro, but an odel kohen could eat. So Mora says, it says ish, and we include there's another kind of a person who cannot eat, and that's an odel. Says how do you know to say that an odel cannot eat? And an oinen could eat, maybe it's the other way around. Mistabra makes sense. Areilus have a little bit. It makes sense to exclude areilus. It came for the reasons we said yesterday. First of all, maisim, you have to do an activity to fix yourself up, and kurusim, you get cutters if you don't. And we also said it's on your own body, and also we said that we said yesterday that if you're eved as well, it holds you back, and also we said the double that it's it was before dibur, it was before matan teda, and more explains. You have to do activity or you have to do it in your own body. You get cut if you don't do it. It already existed before matan teda. This milas chorav avodim, not only your own meal but even your avodim. So strict. That's why also we'll say an odel, somebody's not circumcised cannot eat truma. By an odel, once you mal yourself, you're overdone with. Mashenkin can happen on a number of occasions, and it's probably it can happen to anyone, not only limited to men. It's beyond your control. So you're right, hanach nefish. But the Arelos has more stringencies. And Rabbi said the same we learned yesterday. Forget the fact that it's more. Cross in the pasuk, we're right in the middle of Ayin Aleph on the middle page. Ish. It says ish. Ezu dover, which and says twice ish, as if to stress only a man. What is it that only applies to men? The aina beisha, not the woman. That only a man and not a woman is the odel. And therefore it says ish, who's the extra person that we're disqualifying. Meaning truma is an odel. What does he do with the Shavah? Obviously, it's not extra for Zeh Shavah. So what does he do with the words Toshiv? What's it coming to teach you? Omar B'Shmaya. Shmaya says, interesting. Come and teach you La'asui Arvi. If you have an Arab, Mo, they all circumcise themselves. Or Givoini Mo, or Givoini, who circumcise themselves. They're from the B'nai Keturah. They're Goyim who circumcised. And it comes to tell you that they also cannot participate in the current Pesach, even though they are circumcised. You can someone ask, I need to exclude them. Why? You would have thought because they're circumcised, they're allowed to eat the Korban Pesach. Just because they're physically circumcised, you think spiritually that's considered circumcised. But Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah. All the goyim are considered an oral, even the physically circumcised, since halachically they don't have to, it's as if nothing happened. But now, we learned if a person says, koinim, I'm going to ask myself. It's a language of vows. We'll see in Gemara in the Durham. I'm going to ask myself if I have any pleasure from an arelim. Who are arelim? Mutter b'areli Yisrael. So he's allowed to have pleasure from a yid, even though they're uncircumcised. Because when you say arelim, what do you mean? Arelim is a generic name for all goyim, because the fact that they're circumcised means nothing. And a yid, even though he's not circumcised, since halachically he should, is as if he is circumcised. Yeah. But he's forbidden, even though the goy is gemalet, since he only said arelim, all goyim fall under that. Koinim, then he says, Koinim shanin el moilim. If he says, I'm asking myself to have any hana from somebody who is circumcised, who shouldn't he have hana from? He's allowed to have hana from goyim. But also but he's not allowed to have hana from any yid, even though he's physically uncircumcised. Is that what do we see from here? That all goyim halachically, or all goyim is considered, according to the vernacular of the Durham, but general halacha as well, as if they're uncircumcised, because halacha doesn't mandate that they should circumcise themselves. So if all goyim are considered uncircumcised, why in the world would you need a pasuk to tell you about Korban Pesach that a goy cannot participate in the Korban Pesach? So what does he do with Toisha V'Sachar? Ella, to tell you who cannot even Korban Pesach, somebody you would have thought should allow to include a ger. If a ger started the process, Shemol, he already circumcised himself, but like trouble didn't go through the next stage, he go to the mikveh. You would have thought he's on the way, so maybe he can participate in Korban Pesach. It tells you no, you cannot participate in the Korban Pesach. And that's what we learn out from the cotton. The shenoyle chumol, and another case is a child who was born that uncircumcised, and there's a machlekes. We had more Shabbos. A child is born uncircumcised. Is that it? He's already completed the mitzvah, or they still have to do something a nip to make it bleed a little bit. Give a hold. You still have to continue the dam priest, so sort of in midway. And the chiddush is that they cannot eat from it. So the Gemara of Rabbi Lezer doesn't need the pasuk for that. He's consistent with his view. He holds that a gay who started the process and then go to mikveh is actually a gay ma'alyu, is a full-fledged get. And he also holds, somebody holds, if a child is born already circumcised, they're completely circumcised, and therefore the taka could participate in the Korban Pesach. So Toisha V'Sachar is not coming to exclude that at all. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Lezer, okay, fine. So he used a Toisha V'Sachar to teach you this Shabbat. Ish, my avidle. What does he do with the extra word ish? He answers, and we have this many times. But sometimes the Torah repeats itself, and according to some, it's to teach you halach, and others say no. Torah sometimes uses the language, the vernacular of people, and sometimes you just repeat yourself. Says the Gemara, boy, Rab Chama Baruch asked an interesting question. Cotton odel, a child who is not circumcised yet. And we're going to talk about a child who's under 8 days old. In other words, he doesn't have yet the mitzvah. There's a mitzvah now that he has to circumcise over 8 days old, but not yet. So the question is, now we know we just said an adult cannot have any benefit from truma. Is a child before 8 days considered an adult, halachically or not? As Gemara will explain the question. Can you smear oil of truma on it? Because smearing it halachically has the same thing like drinking. Machlekes are showing whether it's ma'atayra midrabanan, but has the same thing as drinking. So the question is, how do we treat the child before the 8th day? Do we say the fact is that the child is uncircumcised and therefore it's ma'akiv, not circumcised, or in fact, because there's no mitzvah, therefore it's not ma'akiv at all. The mitzvah only, even though he has a mitzvah today, then the 8th day he should mal himself. It's not considered as if the mitzvah is today. The mitzvah only starts the 8th day. Or do we say, and therefore right now it's not ma'akiv because there's nothing there. Or do we say no, that what do you call it? Or do we say that he already has a mitzvah today to mal himself, and therefore, since on the 8th day, since he has a mitzvah already now and he's not gemalot yet, he's considered uncircumcised. Toshma, come in here for the following brisa. We can answer your question. It says, all I know is there's 2 psukim. One for your son, if it's not circumcised, they cannot participate in the Korban Pesach, neither can you. And one is regarding an eved, a slave. But the wording in the pasuk is very different. When it comes to your son, it says in the pasuk, "Va'asa Pesach Lashem." I'm just calling you the pasuk. Make the Korban Pesach, which making means shechted. Himoila kol zachar. Then you circumcise every male, and then then you could bring it up. So it says clearly here that you have to first circumcise your son, and then you could bring it up. What process of the Korban Pesach we're talking about? The making of it, the shechting of it. When it comes to an Eved, it says, however, it says, the Chol Eved, any Eved that belongs to you, Umalta Oisa, you circumcise them, and then Oz Yochaboy, then they eat from it. So when we don't care where they were up to when it comes to the shechting, we say that in order for them to eat, we need to make sure at that stage that they're circumcised, as if the Eved only came onto the horizon right before eating, but by the child, as if it came on the horizon right before the shechting. So says the Gemara. Toshma ain't all I know is that what if your son is not circumcised when you're shechting the animal, then it's a problem. Or our Eved is a problem only when it comes to time of eating. And if you have an Eved that wasn't circumcised, that he cannot eat. In other words, it sounds like you could shech the carbon while your Eved isn't circumcised, but you cannot eat your carbon while he's uncircumcised. Now, how do you know that it doesn't really matter? That as well, your avodim have to be circumcised even before you shech, and your son has to be circumcised even before you eat, even though it didn't matter when it came to shechting. And it comes up afterwards. You need to make sure the circumcised before eating. So we say, Tamaleim, Oz, Shavah. In both of them, says the word Oz. By an Eved, it says, after you malam, Oz, Yechaboy, only then you can eat from it. And by your son, it says, Himala Kozacha, you malam, but Oz, Yikavasai. So then you can say, Oz, Shavah, that they both have to be gemalat at the same times when it comes to shechting and eating. Now the Gemara says, let's understand exactly the practicality of this. It's possible you can have two circumstances, two scenarios. One is that the Eved was already your Eved before the shechting, so make sure he's circumcised. And one is he wasn't around during the shechting, but you bought him afterwards that afternoon, and therefore it has to be circumcised before the eating. That makes sense. It's possible. You can have a possibility, a case where the Eved wasn't there when you came to shechting the animal. So you were able to shecht. It only became your Eved afterwards. You bought it after you shechted the Korban Pesach, but before you sat down to eat, make sure you're circumcised. Elos Charav. How is it possible a case if you have a Zachar and you already had to mala him before the shechting? So what's the Torah have to tell you about maling him before the eating? How can you have a child that wasn't chayiv to mala by the shechting, but you're chayiv to mala by the eating? How is it possible? If that day is chayiv of meal, it's chayiv the whole day. How can you find it? How is that possible? In other words, this child had no chiyav of meal when it came to shechting the animal. And what happened? The child was born afterwards. There's no chiyav of meal yet, unless you're going to say that the moment the child is born, the child is already considered an adult. And for the first 8 days, you can't eat Korban Pesach. It must be the born after you shechted the animal, so he wasn't a problem then. But now that the child is born, even though it's day number 1, it's a problem. That even though the mitzvah of Milah doesn't kick into the 8th day, the fact is you have a child in Odel, and therefore you cannot eat on Pesach. Omar Rabba says, Rabba, does that make sense? Says Rabba, let me ask you a question. The Pasuk says, Himal loy kol zocher Omar Rachman. Torah says, if you can circumcise the child, you must circumcise the child. In other words, the only time that the Torah says that not maling is a problem is if you could have and you didn't. If you mal a child before 8 days, let's say you decide to circumcise a child day number 7, he's not circumcised. You got to do it again on the 8th day. So it doesn't make sense. So to taka what's shot? How can you find a case of a child that wasn't chayiv mila by the shchita and yet chayiv mila by the meal? We're talking about a child that had a fever, that had some kind of a fever, and now the fever had dissipated and disappeared. And now, therefore, you're able to go ahead and mallow the child. Says the Gemara, we have a rule. If a child, let's say, is sick, is yellow, whatever it is sick as was born, whenever the child becomes well, you don't mallow straight away. Then you got to count another 7 days. Day number 8 is you mallow. So if it became well on the day of the Pesach, you don't circumcise that night. It's only 8 days later. So what's the problem? The Avin Lekol Shiva, we give him the full 7 days before you mal him on the 8th day. So the Gemara, it's talking about, let's give him the whole 7 days. Says the Gemara, the Yavin Lekol Shiva. It's talking about a case here where you got better 7 days ago. Got better 7 days ago, and now the 8th day is Ed Pesach. So the question goes back again. If the 8th is Ed Pesach, when does the mitzvah milah start? From the morning. So again, by the time you shechted the animals, already a chiva milah. How are you able to shecht the Pesach if you didn't mallah your child? So any time that you have an issue of malling a child on that day, it's always before the Korban Pesach. How can you have a mitzvah milah before the meal, but the mitzvah wasn't around during the shit of Korban Pesach? It's not possible. So the Gemara, I want you mal in the morning, and the Gemara, So this is an important rule. Normally we say the 8th day, I don't care what time the day the child was born, the 8th day, you mal the child. But if the child was sick and then it gets better, you have to know precisely the moment it got better, because it's 8 days to the moment. It got better at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or when the doctor came in and said the child is all right now, so 3 o'clock, let's say, then you could only mal the child 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 8 days later. So first Gemara asked, before the Gemara knew that, Gemara said, didn't Loidah say that Yom Haver also came up older, that the day became better just like the day was born, and the day was born you can mala anytime. When it comes to the day he's born, you don't care if it's 24 hours, any time of the 8th day you can mala. In fact, the mitzvah is to do as early as possible. The day became better, you don't need meisles. No. The day got better, it's better than the day he was born. The day he was born, you don't need 24 hours. The day he got better, you need it to be exactly that time. So we're talking about that he got better after they brought the Korban Pesach, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So when you brought the Korban Pesach, there was no mitzvah milah yet on this child. Therefore, it didn't prevent you from bringing Korban Pesach. But now, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a mitzvah milah. You cannot eat that night the korban unless you mala the child. So that's one answer the Gemara gives. A possibility where during the Shechita there was no mitzvah milah, but the mitzvah milah started at night. Now, Papa we'll have a few other answers now, a few other scenarios. Now, Papa is going to karvla einili inuka. What happens if not all sicknesses do you have to give it another 7 days? Some it's only if it was a fever that it attacked the entire body. Well, the baby's yellow, but if let's say the eyes hurt, the eye of the child hurt, so you couldn't do a bris milah. And then the Eidbar got better. It got better in the afternoon. You don't have to count another 7 days, but you have to wait till it gets better. Got better in the afternoon. So there's no mitzvah milah by the shchita, but the mitzvah milah kicked in before the night. The Eidbar bein got cured in between. We're talking about a case where the parents were in prison. So they sent a shliach to go ahead and bring a Korban Pesach. The son wasn't circumcised yet, but remember we just learned the only time that we say that the circumcision of the son prevents the Korban Pesach is if he could have done it. Here they couldn't have done it because they were in jail. And because they were in jail, they couldn't have done it, so therefore it doesn't prevent them. And then suddenly they were freed. Now that they were freed 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So during the shechita, there was no issue because they couldn't do it. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they could do it. So they could have, and therefore there's ma'akev of the evening. Now, 2 things. Rashi, first of all, says mitzvah milah mutelas alehem on both of them. So some people want to say Rashi holds the mitzvah milah is on the mother as well, which is a big chiddush, not just on the father. But another interesting thing is, which I didn't say anyone talk about it, is why doesn't what do you mean the father couldn't have malad his child? Just like he's bringing a Korban Pesach using a shliach, why wasn't it a mitzvah for the father or the mother to hire a shliach, get a shliach to circumcise the son? And the famous Ramah over there should pay ches whether you can have a shliach to do pidyon aben, whether you can have a shliach to do for your bish's milah, even though we have a moil and everything else, and you point them as a shliach, or do we say that the mitzvah is if not on you, it's on them? But why, you have to think about why isn't it important? Why don't we say you could have done the milah, get a shliach to mala your son, and therefore it should be ma'akiv the shchita as well. But a papa clearly holds that there's no such mitzvah to get a shliach, or that you shouldn't use a shliach for mitzvah milah. The Gemara continues. I'll give you another example. What about the child? Was a tumtum, which means it had a skin growth over it, and according to Taisus Moshe Shainim, there's no chiv to ever remove that skin. So they had no idea whether it's a boy or girl. So at the time, there's no mitzvah milah. Shenikra, but it ripped open after you brought the Pesach. When Imtzazacha found out a zacha in between. So now you have a mitzvah milah. But you have to make sure it does it before the night. This is an interesting thing here. The baby stuck its head out from the uterus, and as soon as the baby sticks its head out, the baby is already considered alive. And you start counting your 8 days, and then it stayed there. It didn't come out. It went back in, and then it came out on the 8th day. So it wasn't out yet when physically out. You couldn't mal him during the Korban Pesach, but it came out in the afternoon. So therefore now you have a mitzvah milah. Says about Michai, how can live for 8 days? Once the head comes out, we learned once the head comes out, pops out. Everything that was closed, like its mouth, opens up, and everything that was open is now shut. The navel, everything else. And how does the child sustain himself? Now the head went back in. How will the child sustain himself for 8 days? He can't live even for 1 moment because it doesn't feed itself. So we're talking about going to Zonse Ishta. Interesting. The fever. When a person is sick, sometimes you don't eat for days. So how do you survive? Because the fever itself sort of slows your body down completely. It doesn't need as many calories to sustain itself, and it starts somehow or another feeding itself from the water in your body, from other parts of your body. Uses stored fats to feed itself. So the same thing here with the child. The fever took care of the child. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. So therefore, they're sustainable for 8 days, and as soon as they came out, that's when you chayiv mila in the afternoon. See, it doesn't make sense. Each man who's fever, the child. If it's the child's fever, you're telling me the child had a fever. When the baby comes out, you're not chayiv mila straight away. You got to give it another 8 days because it had a fever. We said you wait 8 days. Interesting. The mother was the one who was sick, and the child was able to feed off the fats and all that from the mother as well. What do you boys say? Another answer is that's a little bit hard to understand this. If the child doesn't scream for help, if the child is able to scream, able to cry, and everything else, then somehow or another it's able to sustain itself. Either if the child starts screaming, it's somehow or another that it wakes up the child able to sustain itself from its mother, or I'm not sure exactly how it works. If the child is able to scream itself. Now we continue. The says somebody's not circumcised is mekabel has even though he's not circumcised, he's able already to, if somebody's tummy, you have to spray the paraduma the 3rd and 7th day, and even though at the moment he's not circumcised, he can do that. She came at Sina Baba saying we find actually we're talking about what do you call it? And even though it's not all the time, we don't say, the hazos worthless. Says the Gemara, she came at Sinu Baba saying that we find by our ancestors, she kiblu hazok shehenareli in by Yeshua, they had to throw. Most of the Eden were not circumcised, but they were eating at Korban Pesach and they were all tummy. Now, why were they all tummy? According to Rashi, they were all tummy because they had to bury the dead every year for 40 years. They died, which is a bit hard to understand for 2 reasons. First of all, as Rashi tells us in Mortainus and Babasra, that they dug their own graves and they went in themselves. But that isn't really a question because someone had to cover them. So they covered them. They were oil covering over them. But according to Taisus and others, the last year nobody died. They died, and that's the Yom Tov of Tu B'Av, because nobody died the last year. So they would have become Torah way before then. So why are they still tummy? Why are they still tummy? What do you call it? Anyway, so Rashi then brings another opinion that says because kol ha'poilish min ha'ola, if you circumcise yourself, that in itself makes it tummy. Rashi doesn't like that pshat, but I think those who learn that pshat is because they have a problem with Rashi pshat. Why were they tummy when people bury themselves? Anyway, so they were mekabel when they went into Israel, even though they weren't circumcised yet. And Shneimar says, how do I know? It says, when did they enter Israel? On the 10th day of Nisan. Harishon Ba'asar on 10th day. Lo mihili. Now they weren't circumcised yet. They couldn't circumcise on the 10th day because they were very, very weak. He's Hazor Amos Avilu. But they wanted to Korban Pesach on the 14th day, and you need the 3rd and the 7th. So the 3rd day can only be on the 10th day of Nisan, so the 7th would be on the 14th in the morning. Is aim is so they had to be, and they didn't mal it to the 11th day. So it must be that they all received the Hazor when they were still Arelim. Says the Gemara. Now the Gemara doesn't make a distinction. Maybe there's a difference between the 3rd day and the 7th day, between the first spring and the second spring. So either all or nothing. If you need, if an adult is disqualified from the 7th day, it's also disqualified from the 3rd day. So Gemara asks, who said they made a Korban Pesach? Which is a difficult understanding Gemara's question because the pasuk says clearly, it can't be. The Chesiv, it says clearly in the pasuk there, by Yas was a Pesach, they made the Pesach on the 14th day of that year. And I'm not sure exactly what the Gemara's question was. So who said that they were tired? Maybe they were all tamei. It says clearly in the Braise, Molu, they maled themselves, but Toglu, they went to the mikveh, but Osut, Pischaim, Betara, they were all tired. The only way they've got tired is by sprinkling the afer of the Paraduma. So it must be that even though they were an adult, you can spray. The Priya Mila Lavram Avinu. There's two stages of milas when you cut through them. There's the top skin and the lower skin. The thick skin is the top one. You cut the top one, that's mila. And then there's another one called Priya, opening it up, where you see the mother using his nail, he tears open the bottom skin, which is a much thinner membrane, then it opens it up. So Rabbi Avram Avinu didn't have the mitzvah Priya. Remember it says, "Be'eis hahi amar Hashem el Yeshua." Hashem then told Yeshua, I say to make these sharp things, and then go ahead and mala the Jews again a second time. So therefore, what did Hashem tell Yeshua they didn't have before? Must be that he gave them the mitzvah priya, which they didn't have before. Says the Gemara. Now Taisha says clearly that Avraham Avinu did priya, but it wasn't mandated to do priya, because Avraham Avinu did all the mitzvahs in the Torah. It just wasn't mandated. Yeah. Now the famous case is always trying to ask, Navim are not allowed to add new mitzvahs. How can you tell me there's a new mitzvah given to Yeshua called priya? So Torah already says it was given to Moshe, halach Moshe, but Yeshua put it into a pasuk. How do you know that it's talking about priya? Maybe Hashem is telling Yeshua, all those people that weren't gemalit are now. But it says in pasuk, kimulim that all those people left Mitzrayim were all circumcised. But all those who were born in the Midbar were not circumcised. It says the Gemara, Im Kain, if you can learn Pshat, that what? That is talking about all those people who were born in the Midbar weren't Gemal. That's what Hashem told you, sure. Who said he gave him a second stage of Milah? Those who were Gemal already, leave them be. Hashem told you, sure, there were so many Eden who weren't circumcised yet. Go circumcise them. How do you know that he's telling them that even those who are circumcised, give them the second stage of Priya? The Gemara, because look at the wording in the pasuk. So my shuv, it says go ahead again to the Eden, change the second time. Shuv is again. What do you mean again? If they're already, he's only going to those who never circumcised. And a lot of the priya, he's going back to the people who already were circumcised, and he's doing priya. Umay sheni. So what do you mean a second time again? Now that you said the word shuv, shuv means the second time. Why say shenis? So the Gemara la kushe seif mila the chilas mila to tell you that the second stage priya is as important as the first stage of mila itself. Mat chilas mila makeba, just like the beginning mila without it, it means you're an odol. Av seif mila makebas boy. So to the priya also, if you don't do that, you're an odol. Now we learned. Elu hein tzitzina ma'akvinis amila. These are the strings that are still attached, as if you haven't done the mi'il at all. Basar achayvas reifat Torah, the flesh that covers most of the crown. And the ain oichel b'truma, as a result, you're considered an oral, even though you did most of the circumcision. But if you still have strings attached, you were considered as if you're an oral, and you cannot eat truma. Omar Ravina, v'itein b'ravim b'rabba, Omar Rav. Basar ha'chayfe es roiv goyva shalatora. This is the flesh that covers most of the height of the crown. That all has to be, cut through. Okay. We'll stop over here and continue tomorrow. We're still focusing on the Eden in the Midbar, why they didn't circumcise. Why Taka did they circumcise themselves? It seems that the majority didn't. What happened there? But Yeshua is the one who gave us the mitzvah of Priya.